It began not with the clash of armies, but with the rhythm of steel wheels. In the spring of 1944, a long train of sealed boxcars rolled across the heart of America, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, carrying 600 men who had once sworn allegiance to the Reich. The war they left behind was gray, hungry, and broken. The land they passed through now was green and endless, dotted with windmills and barns that glowed under electric light. Through the cracks in the wooden slats, they saw families gathered around dinner tables, neon signs flickering over diners, children chasing dogs along dirt roads. One prisoner whispered, "The Americans must be lying to us. No nation could possess such abundance." The others nodded in silence. For years, their officers had told them America was decadent, chaotic, a land of weak men and wasted wealth. Yet every mile of track betrayed that lie a little more. Inside the train, the air smelled not of fear, but of coffee. When the guards passed around sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, one of the Germans refused to touch his. Another unwrapped it slowly, took a bite, and began to cry. "Real bread," he murmured, as though tasting a memory from another life. Outside, the prairie widened into a horizonless light. Somewhere between disbelief and awakening, they realized. This was not propaganda. This was America, the enemy that lived better in war than Germany did in peace. They didn't know it yet, but behind those barbed wires waiting ahead, their world would fall apart, not by bullets, but by kindness. The next morning, the train slowed near a small Texas town where the horizon shimmered with heat. The prisoners were told to disembark, hands unbound, eyes still wary. The smell hit them first. It wasn't smoke or gunpowder. It was coffee, rich, roasted, unmistakably American. Somewhere nearby, a soldier was frying bacon on a steel plate. The Germans glanced at each other, confused. Their rations in Europe had been gray bread and watery soup. Here, the guards carried steaming mugs and paper-wrapped sandwiches. One private muttered, "They must be showing off for propaganda." Another replied, "Then why are they letting us taste it?" Soon, metal cups were passed along the line. Hot coffee, bitter and alive, stung their tongues. A sergeant who had fought at Tobruk whispered, "This smells like victory, only it's not ours." The train whistle screamed, and laughter echoed from the American soldiers loading crates nearby. Laughter that didn't sound cruel, just effortless. As the train began to move again, one POW leaned his head out through the bars. He saw a billboard rising over the plains, bright colors, a smiling woman holding a bottle of Coca-Cola. For a second, he forgot the war entirely. They were prisoners, yes, but in that moment they felt something stranger, the weight of envy. Freedom wasn't an idea here. It had a scent, a taste, and it was everywhere. What they didn't know yet was that the real shock would come when they reached the camps. They first heard the rumor on that same train, whispered through the rows of prisoners like a secret weapon. "Did you know," one guard said, half joking, "that in America we can build a ship in 4 days?" The Germans burst out laughing. 4 days? It was impossible. In Bremen, a Liberty-class cargo ship would take months, thousands of men, endless parts. One engineer among the prisoners, a former shipbuilder from Kiel, shook his head. "Propaganda," he muttered. "Americans exaggerate everything." But a few days later, at the camp library, a newspaper lay open on the desk. "Liberty ship built in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. New record at Richmond shipyard." There was a photo of the workers, men and women, smiling, holding wrenches and coffee cups. Not soldiers, civilians, ordinary people building a fleet faster than the Reich could destroy it. That night, the shipbuilder sat alone by the barracks window. He ran his fingers along the wood frame, tracing imaginary welds. He had spent his life perfecting the art of steel, yet these people treated it like a factory line. It wasn't arrogance that hollowed him. It was awe. From the loudspeaker outside came faint music, Benny Goodman's clarinet over static. The American guards were laughing again somewhere near the gate. The German engineer whispered to himself, "If they can build ships like that, how do we ever win?" He didn't know it yet, but the next shock would come not from machines, but from light itself. The first night inside the camp felt unreal. The fences were there, tall, coiled, watchtowers humming in the dark. But beyond them, the world glowed. Floodlights lit the perimeter, casting long, silver shadows across the dust. Yet farther out, past the barbed wire, another light shimmered. A town still awake. One German, a mechanic from Hamburg, stared through the gaps in the planks. In Germany, blackout orders were strict. Even a candle could bring bombs. Here, entire streets glittered like daylight. Neon signs blinked red and blue. Gas stations still open. Cafes still serving. "They waste light," he muttered, "like gods waste stars." The camp barracks were simple, wooden, clean. On each bunk, a thin mattress, a blanket, and, impossibly, a bulb that burned all night. The guards didn't even turn it off. One POW covered his eyes with his arm, whispering, "How can they afford to sleep in brightness?" Outside, cicadas whirred beneath the Texas night. The hum of electricity filled the air like distant music. Some men turned away, trying to hold on to the image of the fatherland, dark, hungry, proud, but light seeps into every crack. That night, they didn't dream of home. They dreamed of lamps that never went out. What they didn't know yet was that even the food waiting for them would taste like a different kind of freedom. The morning after arrival, the prisoners lined up for breakfast. No one spoke. The clang of metal trays echoed under the Texas sun. They expected the usual gray porridge or stale crusts like in Europe. Instead, soldiers in white aprons slid plates across the counter, slices of soft white bread, butter, and something bubbling brown in glass bottles. One of the Germans frowned. "Coca-Cola?" he whispered, sounding out the foreign name like a code word. Another guard laughed and popped the cap. The hiss startled them. Foam spilled, sweet and unreal. A few prisoners refused to drink. Others stared at the bread, so pale it looked unreal, almost holy. A sergeant from Bremen finally tore a piece off and chewed. His eyes widened. "It's sweet," he said quietly, and soft. A ripple of disbelief passed through the line. They had been taught that Americans were wasteful, lazy, indulgent. Yet here was proof that abundance could be gentle. Later, one of them scribbled in his journal, "We eat better as prisoners here than our people do at home. What is this country?" Outside the mess hall, a truck rumbled past, carrying crates marked Coca-Cola Bottling Co. The prisoners followed it with their eyes as if watching a parade. In that moment, they didn't feel conquered. They felt small. But that was nothing compared to what they saw next. The miracle of ice in the middle of war. It happened a week later, on a day so hot, the air itself seemed to tremble. Work detail had just ended. The prisoners stood near the fence, shirts stuck to their backs, dust in their throats. Then a jeep rolled in, olive green, roaring American. Two guards in sunglasses jumped out carrying metal tubs packed in ice. At first, the Germans thought it was medicine, but then came the smell. Sweet cream, vanilla, something they hadn't tasted since before the war. One of the guards grinned and shouted, "Ice cream time, boys!" The Americans began passing paper cups around, scooping white mounds that smoked in the heat. The POWs stared, frozen. Ice in Texas, cream in wartime. It was absurd. One young prisoner laughed out loud, thinking it was a cruel joke. Then the guard handed him a cup. He tasted it, and everything stopped. Cold, sweet, unreal. Tears welled up in his eyes before he could hide them. "Ice. Cream," he whispered in disbelief. A lieutenant, once proud and rigid, set his spoon down and murmured, "Only a nation that can afford ice cream during war can afford to win." Around him, men who had marched through the ruins of Europe now sat quietly, eating like children rediscovering summer. Beyond the fence, cicadas sang in the high grass. The Americans laughed, sharing their own cones. There was no hatred here, just the hum of engines, the clink of spoons, and the melting of pride. They thought they'd seen the limits of kindness, but what waited next on that journey would shake them deeper, a train ride that felt more like a hotel than a prison. A week later, orders came to move a group of prisoners north. They were herded toward the rail yard again, expecting the same wooden boxcars, the smell of dust, heat, and iron. Instead, waiting for them stood a gleaming Pullman train, polished dark green, the brass letters shining like gold, curtains on the windows, white linens folded on seats. The guards waved them aboard without rifles raised. Inside, the air was cool, perfumed faintly with soap and coffee. Upholstered seats, not benches. One prisoner ran his hand along the fabric as if afraid it would vanish. Another leaned back, staring at the ceiling fan turning lazily above. A young American corporal passed through the aisle, tipping his cap. "Breakfast will be served in an hour, gentlemen." The word gentlemen landed like a stone in their chests. When the food came, eggs, toast, even fruit, the Germans sat stiff, waiting for the trick, but none came. The guards simply ate with them, talking about baseball, girls, the weather. A sergeant whispered to his comrade, "They treat prisoners better than our officers treated us." Outside the window, the land rolled past. Cotton fields, small towns, kids waving flags at the passing train. Behind those bars of steel and glass, the prisoners were silent, trying to understand what kind of enemy offered comfort instead of cruelty. They didn't know it yet, but the next revelation would pierce deeper, not through the stomach or pride, but through mercy itself. It started with a cough, dry, hollow, constant. The man's name was Karl, a 24-year-old infantryman from Dresden. Within days, his skin burned with fever. The camp medic checked his pulse, frowned, and made a quiet phone call. The next morning, an ambulance arrived, white with a red cross gleaming under the sun. The prisoners thought it was a mistake. In Germany, the sick were left to recover or die in their bunks. No one wasted medicine on an enemy. Yet the guards carried Karl out carefully, lifting him as if he were one of their own. They even shaded his eyes from the light. He was taken to a military hospital in Abilene. There, nurses in crisp uniforms changed his sheets twice a day. Doctors spoke softly to him in broken German, telling him not to worry. And then came the miracle: penicillin, a word he'd only heard whispered among German medics, a rumor, a myth. The Americans injected it like it was nothing. Days later, the fever broke. Karl sat up in a clean bed, staring at the flowers someone had left on the table, carnations and a Bible. Outside, he could hear a phonograph playing Glenn Miller's Moonlight Serenade. When they brought him back to camp, the other prisoners gathered around him in disbelief. One asked, "They saved you? With their new drug?" Karl nodded. "They didn't even ask my name first." That night, no one sang the German marching songs. They sat in silence, watching the floodlights sweep across the wire, wondering what kind of world they had been fighting against. It was the first crack in the iron wall of belief, but soon the truth would strike even harder, not from medicine or mercy, but from technology beyond imagination. The projector flickered to life in the camp's recreation hall. Rows of prisoners sat on wooden benches, their khaki uniforms faded, faces expressionless. The Americans called it Education Night, a film showing about the war's progress. Most of the Germans came for the warmth, not the message. On the screen, a Liberty ship crossed the Atlantic under escort. Then, the narrator's voice cut through the static. Using radar technology, our Navy can now detect enemy aircraft and submarines miles before they appear. At first, laughter rippled through the crowd. Radar? Impossible. The Reich had spent years trying to make it work reliably, and even then it was primitive, heavy, fragile, short-ranged. But the film showed something else. A small dish rotating smoothly, waves pulsing across the ocean, bright blips lighting up the screen like stars. In the front row, a prisoner named Heinrich, once an engineer at Siemens, stopped laughing. He leaned forward, his eyes reflecting the light of the projector. He could tell the demonstration was real. The precision, the frequency, the clarity. It wasn't a trick. It was mastery. After the film ended, no one moved. The Americans switched on the lights, and the guards began chatting casually, unaware that the entire hall had just gone silent. One man muttered, "If they have this, they can see everything." Heinrich turned to the window, staring through the wire toward the distant glow of the guard tower's spotlight. That circle of light suddenly felt symbolic, like an eye that never closed. That night, he couldn't sleep. He imagined a sky full of invisible waves, of signals bouncing across the world, a kind of vision his country had never truly achieved. They had built their pride on the myth of superiority. That night, under the hum of an American radar tower, that myth began to die. But the next revelation would not be about machines. It would be about people. Ordinary Americans who turned work into something holy. They were sent out on work detail to a nearby town. Nothing special, just a contract farm tool factory that had lost its workers to the draft. The Germans expected rusted machines, shortages, fatigue. What they found instead was motion, relentless, musical motion. Inside the plant, belts hummed, engines roared, and sparks leapt from welders' torches like fireflies. Rows of women in denim overalls and bandanas worked the presses, wiping sweat from their foreheads, laughing between shifts. Posters on the walls read, "We can do it, and keep 'em rolling." The prisoners stood frozen, watching as tractors, engines, and parts flowed down the line with impossible rhythm. Every movement was efficient, almost joyful. No overseers shouted, no whips cracked. People simply worked, fast, proud, unafraid. One guard noticed the Germans staring and said, "Not bad, huh? Most of these ladies are farmers' wives." A prisoner scoffed, trying to hold on to his pride. "Women don't build machines," the guard smirked. "Here they do." When the whistle blew, workers poured outside for lunch. Sandwiches, Coca-Cola, and laughter. Music from a radio filled the yard. A young woman looked up, smiled, and waved to the prisoners across the fence. For a moment, no one waved back. They didn't know how. That night, one of the Germans, a former machinist, wrote in his notebook, "They fight with factories. They win with songs. Even their women work like armies." He stared at his rough hands, the calluses earned from a war that no longer made sense. The hum of the factory echoed in his dreams, steady, endless, like the pulse of a giant that never slept. But the next thing they would see would not inspire awe. It would break something deeper inside, their pride in what they thought was discipline. It began with a smell, the rich, heavy scent of meat. A supply truck had backed up behind the camp kitchen, unloading crates stamped U.S. Army rations. The Germans stood nearby, waiting for their meal, when a soldier kicked over one of the boxes. Cans spilled out, dented and unopened. The cook barked something, and the guards began tossing them into a pit. One of the prisoners stepped closer, frowning. "Why are they throwing them away?" he asked through the interpreter. The American shrugged. "Expired last week." The Germans stared. Perfectly good meat, beans, fruit, all buried under the Texas dust. In the Reich, people traded ration cards for crumbs, mothers boiled grass to survive. Here, they were burning food because it was too old. A lieutenant with hollow cheeks whispered, "They fight a war and still waste enough to feed our cities." No one answered. They only watched as an American guard lit a match, tossed it into the pit, and turned away. The flames swallowed the cans with a dull hiss. That night, the smell of cooked meat lingered in the air. Some of the men couldn't eat their dinner. Others did, but slowly, in silence. Inside the barracks, a former officer wrote in his journal, "This is not arrogance, it is abundance. And abundance is the one thing that breaks a soldier faster than fear." For the first time, they stopped envying America's weapons. They envied its waste, the proof that loss here meant nothing. But the next day would bring something stranger still. Music behind the wire, and applause that crossed from enemy to enemy. It started with a violin, one that had somehow survived the journey across the Atlantic, hidden in a crate of uniforms. The owner, a young Bavarian musician named Otto, had carried it through the front lines, through surrender, through every mile of defeat. In the camp, he played alone at night, soft and slow, until even the guards stopped to listen. One evening, the American warden approached him and said, "You should play for everyone." Otto hesitated. Music had always belonged to the Reich. Marches, anthems, command. What was left of beauty when you'd used it for war? But a week later, the barracks turned into a concert hall. POWs built a makeshift stage out of old boards, hung sheets for curtains, tuned scavenged instruments. When the first notes of Beethoven rose into the warm Texas air, even the guards stood still. Outside the wire, townspeople gathered by the fence to listen. Children climbed the posts. Mothers held babies against their shoulders. No speeches, no flags, only music that belonged to everyone. For the first time in years, the prisoners weren't soldiers or enemies. They were simply men, their eyes closed, lost in something greater than fear or pride. When the final note faded, there was silence, then applause, loud, honest, human. Otto bowed his head, tears streaking the dust on his face. "They respect our music," he whispered, "not our madness." That night, even the floodlights seemed softer. Some of the guards hummed the melody as they walked their rounds. For the prisoners, the fences felt thinner, like they might dissolve if the song played just a little longer. But soon, the next revelation would arrive quietly, in pages and paper, books that would teach them about the enemy's soul. The library sat in a converted barracks, its walls lined with shelves built by the prisoners themselves. At first, the books arrived in Red Cross shipments, dictionaries, grammar guides, history texts. Then the Americans began bringing more: Twain, Emerson, Whitman, the Bible. The Germans filed in quietly, as if stepping into a church. Most came out of boredom. Others came because it was the only place in camp where silence was allowed. One by one they began to read, haltingly, slowly, their fingers tracing the words like Braille. A former schoolteacher named Dieter discovered the grapes of wrath. He expected propaganda, yet found a story of American suffering, of dust and hunger and dignity. "They have their poor, too," he whispered to his bunkmate. "They just don't hide them." Another prisoner, once a party loyalist, began reading the Bible for its English practice. Weeks later, he was still reading. He underlined a verse, "Love your enemies." One night, he showed it to an American guard through the wire. The guard smiled. "Good line, huh?" By midsummer, the library had become a sanctuary. Men who once believed in conquest now studied democracy, poetry, and theology. They debated, questioned, laughed. The walls that propaganda had built began to crumble. Not by lectures, but by words printed in a language they were never meant to understand. A senior officer who had taught philosophy before the war looked around the reading room one evening and said softly, "They conquered us with kindness." Outside, the light from the windows spilled across the sand like a soft halo. For the first time, the camp didn't look like a prison. It looked like a school. But soon, a different kind of silence would return. The silence of shame. Letters home that said too much and received no reply. Mail day always stirred the camp. The prisoners lined up near the small wooden shack that served as the post station, clutching envelopes written in stiff, careful German script. Each letter was a lifeline, proof that someone still waited across an ocean of ruins. But over time, something changed. The replies grew fewer. Then they stopped. One evening, a young soldier named Hans opened his letter, read silently, and crumpled it. "My village is gone," he said flatly. No one spoke. Another prisoner showed his. A single sheet returned unopened, stamped addressee deceased. For others, the silence came in different ways. Their words were too honest. One had written, "We live better here as prisoners than you do at home." He never heard from his family again. The censor's stamps couldn't erase the guilt that leaked through every sentence. Each word of comfort became an accusation. "We are safe. We are fed." How do you say that to people starving under the same flag you once died for? At night, men sat on their bunks with paper in front of them, pens unmoving. The act of writing itself had turned into shame. A former officer, the same man who once shouted orders at the front, now folded his letter carefully and whispered, "They will never forgive us for surviving." The floodlights hummed outside. No one sang anymore. The orchestra's violin lay silent on its cot. The only sound was the wind pushing against the wire, as if carrying messages that no longer had a place to land. But soon, the outside world would force its way back in. Not through letters, but through photographs of something none of them wanted to believe. It arrived folded between two English newspapers in the camp library, a single black and white photograph that should never have existed, a line of skeletal men behind barbed wire, eyes hollow, ribs like cages. The caption read, "Allied forces liberate Nazi concentration camp, Buchenwald." At first, the German prisoners laughed. They called it propaganda, another American fabrication meant to humiliate them. One man tore the photo in half and tossed it aside. "Lies," he spat. "Our camps are orderly, humane." But the librarian, an American corporal from Ohio, said nothing. He simply laid out the next issue of Life magazine. Page after page, piles of bodies, ovens, children's shoes, and in the corner a sign in Gothic script, "Arbeit macht frei." The room went silent. The laughter died in their throats. Someone whispered, "This can't be real." The Red Cross later confirmed the reports. Eyewitness accounts arrived, prisoners who had seen it with their own eyes. The disbelief didn't collapse all at once. It cracked, slowly, painfully. That night, one man, a lieutenant who had once believed in everything, ripped the eagle patch from his sleeve. Another burned his insignia behind the barracks, the flames small but fierce. The smoke curled into the sky like a confession. For days, no one spoke of it aloud. They went to work, ate, slept, and pretended the photographs didn't exist. But their eyes had changed. Something had died that wasn't only pride, it was certainty. One diary entry from that week reads, "We lost the war long before we surrendered. We just didn't know it yet." But history wasn't finished with them. News was spreading fast. Germany had fallen. And soon, the radio would bring the words that ended everything. The news came not with a shout, but with a radio hum. On May 8, 1945, the camp loudspeaker crackled to life. Static first, then a calm American voice. "Germany has unconditionally surrendered. The war in Europe is over." No one moved. Some men froze halfway through breakfast, spoons suspended. Others simply stared at the ground. It wasn't joy, not even defeat, just emptiness, like the sound had drained the air from their lungs. Outside, a few guards took off their helmets. No celebration, no jeering. They understood what it meant to the men behind the wire. Not liberation, but revelation. Then softly from one barracks, a voice began to sing. Another joined in. Deutschland über alles. The anthem rose into the Texas sky, trembling, off-key, fragile. It wasn't pride anymore. It was mourning. For cities burned, for brothers gone, for a dream that had turned to ash. When the song ended, an American guard turned off his cigarette and walked to the radio shack. A moment later, music filled the camp again. Not marches, but a slow symphony. Beethoven. The same notes Otto had played weeks before. No one spoke. Some sat on the dirt with their heads in their hands. Others looked toward the horizon as if they could see across the ocean to what was left of home. A captain who had once fought in North Africa whispered, "We began as soldiers. We end as witnesses." That night, the floodlights burned softer. The barbed wire shimmered like silver threads under the moon. Somewhere, a guard and a prisoner smoked the same cigarette in silence. They thought the story was over. It wasn't, because when the war ended, not everyone wanted to go home. When the trucks finally came for repatriation, the prisoners lined up again, bags in hand, faces unreadable. The Americans checked names from a clipboard, waving them toward the gate that opened east, toward ships and ruins. Most went quietly, eager to see what was left of home. But not all. A few men hung back in the shadows of the barracks. Among them was Friedrich, a 40-year-old craftsman from Cologne. He had fought in North Africa, been captured at Tunis, and spent 2 years under the Texas sun. Now, when his name was called, he didn't move. "Friedrich Weber!" the sergeant shouted again. No answer. An American guard approached him. "You're free to go," he said kindly. Friedrich looked at the open gate, the buses idling in the heat. "Free?" he repeated, almost laughing. "To what? Rubble? Hunger? Graves?" He shook his head. "Here I work. I eat. I sleep without fear." The guard hesitated. "You'd rather stay a prisoner?" Friedrich smiled faintly. "I would rather stay human." Weeks later, when the last convoy rolled out, Friedrich and a handful of others remained behind. They helped dismantle the camp fences, repaired farm tools, planted trees along the perimeter. When locals asked why they hadn't gone home, one answered simply, "Because this is where we first learned what home means." The U.S. government later transferred them to civilian farms before sending them back months later, almost by force. Many cried as the ships pulled away from New York Harbor, not from joy, but from something harder to name, grief for a country that wasn't theirs. Years after, some would return, not as prisoners but as guests, carrying flowers and photographs, searching for the fences that had once defined their world. But before that homecoming, the story would split between those who rebuilt and those who tried to forget. After the war, they scattered like leaves in the wind. Some returned to the ruins of their towns, others to families who barely recognized them. But a few carried something invisible, a different kind of wound, the one that doesn't bleed. One of them was Ernst, a former POW who had worked in the camp library. Back in Munich, he found the university reduced to rubble, its professors gone, its shelves turned to ash. So he built a school from scrap wood and memory. He taught English, the language he had once learned behind barbed wire. On the first day of class, he wrote on the blackboard, "Freedom begins where fear ends." His students thought it was an American proverb. He never corrected them. Another was Carl, the soldier who had survived pneumonia thanks to penicillin. He went home to a bombed farmhouse near Bremen and found his fields salted with debris, his family lost. Yet, he planted anyway. Each spring, the earth gave a little more. His neighbors called him the farmer who smiles too much. They didn't know why. But every dawn, as he held his coffee and watched the mist roll in, he remembered the guards who'd once shared theirs with him. Both men kept in touch with their former captors. Letters crossed the ocean, stories of harvests, weddings, children. America, Carl wrote in one of them, is not a place. It's a way of treating people. They had seen another world and could never unsee it. Decades later, when the wounds of war had faded to wrinkles and dust, Ernst told his students about a camp in Texas where enemies became teachers and fences became classrooms. That, he said softly, was where I learned that victory isn't about who wins, it's about who forgives first. But forgiveness is never the end. Some returned to America, chasing ghosts among the cotton fields and the fences now swallowed by grass. They came back as old men, dressed in Sunday suits that didn't quite fit anymore. The Texas sun still burned the same, but the camp was gone. Only a field now, flat and quiet, the wind rippling through waist-high grass. Hans, the boy who once sang the anthem on Surrender Day, leaned on his cane and stared at where the guard towers had stood. "It feels smaller," he said. Beside him, Otto carried his violin in a weathered case. He opened it, ran a hand along the strings, and smiled. "No," he whispered, "we're just bigger now." They had written letters for months to find this place again. Camp Hearn, Camp Tonkawa, Camp Hereford, the forgotten names of America's invisible towns of captivity. Locals greeted them like neighbors returning from a long trip. Someone brought iced tea. Someone else brought their children, curious to meet the German prisoners who came back to say thank you. Together they walked the perimeter where the fences had once stood. A few barbed wires still rusted under the soil. One man bent down, picked a fragment of metal, and held it in his hand. "This fence held us," he said softly, "but it also freed us." At dusk, they gathered under an oak tree and placed a small plaque in the ground, simple, unadorned. It read, "Here, enemies remembered how to be human." When the last note of Otto's violin drifted into the wind, the Americans and Germans stood together in silence. The sound faded, but the moment didn't. It lingered like a heartbeat, steady and fragile. As they left, Hans turned for one last look. The field glowed gold under the setting sun, and in that light, for just a breath, he could almost see the wire again, shimmering, forgiving, gone. But there was still one voice left unheard, a letter written, but never sent. They found it years later, sealed in a weathered envelope inside an old trunk at a farmhouse near Bremen. The ink had faded, the paper yellowed, but the handwriting was careful, neat, deliberate, as if the writer knew someone would read it long after he was gone. It was addressed simply, "To whoever still remembers." The letter read, "Texas, August 1945. I no longer know what side I belong to. I came here as a soldier, full of words I did not understand. Honor, duty, fatherland. But here I learned other words, mercy, decency, freedom. They are quieter, but stronger. When they gave us bread, I thought it was to shame us. When they played our music, I thought it was to mock us. But it was neither. It was forgiveness, and we were too proud to see it. I do not know what remains of home. Perhaps nothing. But if you ever stand on a field under an open sky and see light on the wire, remember that even in defeat, we were allowed to be human again. Tell them we were wrong, not for losing, but for believing hate could make us strong. Ernst Miller, former POW, Camp Hearn, Texas. The letter was never mailed. The war ended, the camps emptied, and Ernst vanished into history. But when the letter surfaced decades later, it was reprinted in a local newspaper. Readers wept, not for the past, but for the simple truth that had taken a world war to learn. Across the ocean, a veteran who once guarded that same camp clipped the article, folded it carefully, and kept it in his wallet until the day he died. The war had ended long ago, but the words kept breathing. They came as enemies. They left as witnesses. And yet, even that wasn't the end, because somewhere, behind one last fence, waited the image that would close their story forever. The field was empty now. Only the wind remained. It slid through the tall grass, over the faint scar in the earth where the fence once stood. To anyone passing by, it was just another patch of Texas. Quiet, sun-bleached, forgotten. But to the men who had once lived behind that wire, it was sacred ground. A small group gathered there one last time. Americans, Germans, children who'd grown old listening to stories their fathers never quite finished. Someone placed a single strand of rusted barbed wire inside a glass case. It caught the light like silver. Fragile. Beautiful. A historian read aloud from a diary found years earlier the words of a nameless prisoner. They came to take our freedom and gave us back our humanity. Silence followed, the kind that humbles everyone, the kind that feels like prayer. Nearby, an old guard, white-haired, his uniform long gone, stood with his hands in his pockets, eyes misting. "We never knew they'd remember us like this," he said. "We just did our jobs." Beside him, a German veteran smiled faintly. "Maybe that's what mercy is," he said, "doing your job, but choosing to be kind." The sun dipped low, setting the grass on fire with gold. Shadows stretched long across the field. Otto lifted his violin one last time and played, the same melody he'd once played behind the wire. The notes rose softly, trembling, then faded into wind. When the music stopped, no one spoke. They didn't need to. The sound had already said what words never could. That even in war, humanity can survive its own madness. The camera lingers on the fence line, where the last ray of light glints against the old steel. A voice, quiet, weathered, almost a whisper. "They came to America in chains and left with open eyes. If your grandfather had seen this, what would he have said?" The screen fades to black. Then a single line appears. "If this changed how you see war, share it with someone who still remembers." History remembers the battles, the tanks, the heroes, the flags. But the truth of a war isn't found in victory parades or ruined cities. It's found in the quiet moments when a guard shares his coffee with a prisoner, when music crosses a fence, when mercy appears where it has no reason to exist. The camera drifts over black and white photos, young faces behind wire, smiling despite it. A hand offering bread, a violin bow mid-stroke. Then the voice again. "We like to believe that strength wins wars, but it's compassion that heals what strength destroys. America didn't conquer those men with bombs. It conquered them with decency, a weapon more powerful than fear." A pause. The sound of wind, distant laughter, maybe a train far away. Most of them went home. Some never did. But all of them carried the same invisible souvenir. The knowledge that kindness can outlive hatred, and that even a fence, if lit by mercy, can become a gate. The shot fades to an old photograph. A group of men in uniform and work clothes, Germans and Americans standing side by side, hands resting on each other's shoulders. The narrator's final words are almost a breath. Wars end. But what we do to one another? That's the part that lasts. The screen fades to silence, leaving only the hum of the Texas wind, whispering through the grass where the wire once stood.